I didn't realize, but over the next 2 months after waking up from coma, all the memories would come back and be even more complete than they had been before coma. That part was absolutely shocking, but it showed me, as we discuss in detail in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that memories are not stored in the brain. It's one of the last nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience, but there it is. And so deep in my coma, I first became aware of this journey in what I call the earthworm eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive kind of subterranean realm. And it seemed kind of foreboding, especially my words of describing it. The good news is it didn't last forever. There came a slowly spinning white light with a perfect musical melody that opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view and led me up into this brilliant, ultra real gateway valley.
And these some of these things are the most beautiful colors, and they're zooming in, and these orbs are moving in these very strange states. This is all just happening now. And I guess my question to you would be, is that why? Because we're observing something that we weren't aware of?
If you'd asked me about orbs before my coma, I would have scoffed at you. Since then, I've actually had experience with orbs.
I want to welcome everybody back to another episode of The Soul Inspired. Today we have Eben Alexander with us. I've been very excited to talk to him. He is a near-death experiencer and had a near-death experience years ago. We're going to talk to him about that. And I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Well, Joe, thanks a lot. It's great to be here today, and I appreciate your having me on.
I was saying to you before we even started that you're kind of like I don't know, like a near-death experience. You're like the grandfather of it for me because I've been following you for quite a while around what happened to you. So most of my near-death experience guests that I have, I come in blinded and I try to trust my intuition with the questions that I ask. With you, I've watched many videos on you, so I have some background of what happened to you, but talking to you face to face is a different thing. So I'm excited to ask you a few questions. And what I wanted to first start with is if I could look at even before your experience and maybe even head back into childhood. I just want to get a little bit about who you were as a child,
Uh-huh.
your belief systems and things like that leading up until when this happened.
Okay, well, I think one important thing to point out about my childhood is that I was adopted, and that does play in a major way to the overall story. My birth mother was 16 years old, unwed, and I was taken away by social services at age 11 days for failure to thrive. But my birth mother thought that after the Christmas holidays, she would get me back. And then that wasn't working out. But she refused to sign the papers to let me go. And she didn't do that till I was 4 months old. So I
Mm.
basically got stuck in a baby dorm for 4 months. And that, as much as my adoptive father, the neurosurgeon who would know things about memory, tried to tell me you cannot possibly remember those events that happened to you when you were days and weeks old, I'm quite convinced I did remember that abandonment,
Mm.
just as many of us do, even though it can be a subconscious memory. So it really figured into my life and really right up to the time of my near death experience and beyond. But the other important thing to point out is that my adoptive father, who was a neurosurgeon, and his father had been a general surgeon in Eastern Tennessee, but they went to church, and all the time. And my dad fully believed in the power of prayer. He was very scientific, fully aware of Big Bang cosmology and all the modern developments in physics and neuroscience. And yet he also had a very powerful belief in God. Now, like many of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, like I did, I always knew that science is the pathway to truth.
Mm.
And so I tended to, in some ways, I wanted to embrace what I was hearing in church all those times he took me there and all of his beliefs about prayers. And yet, especially through my long career, I spent more than 15 years teaching neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School. I just really couldn't come up with a way to explain how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. And that's why I think my near death experience, due to severe case of bacterial meningoencephalitis back in November of 2008, was such a gift to me. Although, of course, I didn't recognize it when I was going through it, but it was a very powerful kind of demonstration of the eternity of soul, that, our brain is not the creator of consciousness. And to me, having followed all that line of thinking from conventional Newtonian determinism and physicalism, materialism, our conventional science that pretends that the physical world is the only thing that exists. But what I found is that that is absolutely not true. And there's a tremendous, just as Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winner and quantum physicist, said, there's a tremendous amount of truth that will never be proven scientifically.
Mm.
So that's exactly what's going on here. And science actually can help in leading us in the right direction. And science, that's what I like about my 16 years since coma, is working with other scientists around the world who realize that quantum physics, neuroscience, philosophy of mind, non-local consciousness, and parapsychology, all these things show us we need a bigger model of the nature of reality than our simplistic fiction of materialism or physicalism. And that's really where the scientific world and the study of consciousness is going on all of this. So
Wow.
it's an extraordinary time to be alive. My own life has been an actual catalyst in this kind of process of discovery. And I love it that there are hundreds of scientists around the world who are following this pathway towards a kind of a deeper and more profound truth about the nature of reality for all of us. But essentially, it's that our souls are eternal and very interactive.
I think that was what fascinated me when I first heard about your story is was your background in science, obviously, with the work that you did and do and have done over the years. And it's interesting now to hear I don't remember hearing that you grew up kind of in a religious environment. And then as you got older, you kind of led towards the sciences. So you already had a mindset of both sides, right? Going to the church, seeing what is belief, what is God, what are we talking about, and then going into the science. So you must have had kind of a duality happening where you were you fighting with your own belief systems up until the point of the near death experience? I'm just curious about that.
Well, I think what I would say is early on in my life, I'd wanted to believe the religious side of it all. And, my father, a staunch scientist, was also leading the way in that direction. And yet it was just from my own kind of personal experience, interactions with patients, all these kind of things um, that kind of challenged all my beliefs, but essentially took me down a pathway of, well, wait a minute, how does conscious awareness exist independently of the brain? And that's kind of what I was looking for. And that's what I found in my near-death journey was this extraordinary expansion of consciousness. So not only is it the opposite of what a materialist would predict, that your conscious awareness as you come closer to death would shrink down to nothingness. It's actually the opposite, where your conscious awareness expands at the time of bodily death. And our consciousness then can access, souls of departed loved ones. It can access the consciousness of loved ones who are still alive in their bodies, even though they could be thousands of miles away. So, these NDEs are an extraordinary dive into the more broad kind of phenomenon of consciousness itself. And that's where we go, especially in our third book. So, Proof of Heaven is kind of a question mark about, wow, these are amazing experiences and they happen for a lot of people, but how do we explain them? And then there's the book Map of Heaven, which talks about how common these are among all kinds of people and always have been. And then the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, which is co-written with my wife, Karen Newell, and she's been a partner in this work for 13 years or so now. But that book really goes the distance towards uniting the science and spirituality, because to me, it's got to all make sense. And as a scientist, I knew that everything I could discover about my journey had to make sense. And this is kind of the direction it's going in. It's showing this primordial mind that we all really share, and that mental it kind of precedes the physical in this universe, so that all this physical universe we see is actually emerging from our mental. That's one of the deepest lessons of quantum physics, that it's not just some vague accident, but there's a tremendous amount of will involved, the will of sentient beings to kind of guide the emerging reality. And that's what we're involved in. But it's an extraordinary kind of demonstration of mind over matter that brings tremendous potential for us to participate in healing and coming into wholeness.
Mm.
so that any kind of uh, physical, mental, or emotional wellness and healing is ultimately based in kind of a spiritual form. By spiritual, I don't mean anything religious. Religion can be spiritual, but you don't have to have any religious ideology. Have a deep spiritual awareness of our interconnectedness and of the power that our kind of group will has on the emerging reality that we see.
Yeah. I was just thinking to myself the way you just described the way the unconscious works. Even recently, I mean, if you look at the way the world's going, there's a lot of changes happening. Some people don't want to admit that it's happening. Some people are. Some people are in that line. Even for instance, these orbs in the sky people are seeing. I don't know if you've paid any attention to that or seen any of that, but and then there's these people coming out, these whistleblowers talking about how they use their they meditate and bring on these orbs and bring on these, and some people think that's a little woo-woo to talk about right now, but I feel like we're moving in a direction that some of us have to come to terms with that explains a little bit more of what's going on besides just this physical form. And just even as you're describing, we haven't even dug into your near-death experience yet, but you're just talking about the idea that we are much bigger than this, as I call it,
Right.
meat suit. And so now we're really digging in further. And as the sciences kind of combine together, I could see it really exploding over the next 10, 15 years.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. There's a tremendous amount going on now. In many ways, I see this as kind of a resolution of an at least 5,000-year-old struggle uh, within humanity of trying to make sense of our reality. And I think we're finally getting to a point where instead of just denying the evidence, because for the better part of the 20th and early 21st century, the conventional scientific community would try to dismiss near death experiences and shared death experiences. Shared death are just like near death, but they happen in perfectly healthy, normal people. And they usually involve a loved one who's leaving this world. And the shared death person is a bystander soul that gets to go along on the journey, even to the point of witnessing a full blown life review before that bystander soul comes back to this world.
Mm.
But these are extraordinary kind of occurrences. They're very common. About 1 in 5 cardiac arrest patients will have major elements of a near-death experience. So it's estimated that at least 5 million people in the United States have had such an experience. And I can also tell you that they're very much underreported. People who have these experiences are so shocked. It's not like they're coming out and telling the world about it. They're worried people think they're crazy. And our culture to date has not been very widely and broadly accepting of these phenomena. But that's why it's so important that a lot of scientists are taking them seriously and starting to study them, because you find out that there are major patterns that tell us that these are not just vague hallucinations or wishful thinking, but they actually show us something very profound about kind of the expanded state of human awareness that all of us can expect, at the time of bodily death. So and it's also something very important to point out, right at the heart of near-death experiences are what your life review, your life flashing before your eyes. And when you study those scientifically, you find fascinating facts. Like there's a group of almost 700 life reviews that Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia has studied. And in that huge collection of life reviews, he finds something like a third of people say that they revisit their entire life. Now, this might all happen in a 5-minute cardiac arrest. So, how do you revisit your entire life? It's because that realm is completely outside of space and time. You can
Right.
access your whole life and more, future, past, et cetera. A lot of that. Now, the future, I'm not saying is predetermined, but there are indicators out there that show us how the future might evolve. But the reality is, in hypnotic regression and near death experiences and meditation, you can come into much greater wisdom about all of this in terms of your own personal journey and understanding. And this is why, for
Mm.
anyone who doesn't already have a great program for meditation, for quieting the little monkey mind in the head, because that is not your consciousness. The voice in the head is just the ego mind for the most part, for a lot of us. And this is all about quieting that monkey mind. Uh, the voice that I love how Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in your head your annoying roommate. But for me, for the last 11 or 12 years, I've used sacred acoustics, a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. So for anyone out there who needs a powerful tool to help them get into a deep transcendental state of conscious awareness, if you don't have one already, try out sacredacoustics.com. There's some free downloads there, and tremendous resource. I meditate an hour or two a day using sacred acoustics. Been doing that the last 12 or so years, and have found it to be of tremendous value to help me not only recover memories of my NDE, but become a much more facile in my dealings with the kind of guides and forces of knowledge that I first encountered in my near-death experience.
I was actually advised about the binaural beats, the sacred acoustic. I think I've been advised about it. As a musician, I always said the term that I always used was music is my meditation. Growing up, I was writing since age 11, and I had no idea. I think I was more channeling. I think now that I've gotten older, I understand that when I go into these spaces, I kind of start to channel and I just start saying words as I'm playing, and that's where all my music came from. So I can understand. I knew at a young age that there was something else happening. And then when I got into my teen years, I started fearing death. I started understanding that, oh my goodness, one day Joe's not going to be here and he's going to be like, what's that? And that got me down to going to libraries at the time because I mean, I think the internet was out, but there wasn't a ton of information. And I started just reading near-death experiences before they were really popularized. And then that's where I found you later on YouTube and things like that. So, but I've heard that the binaural beats help kind of just calm the mind, especially someone who's got a busy mind. It can really
Right.
kind of just get you into a kind of a wave of movement, and then you can kind of go into that meditative state.
Right. You can learn to ride that sound, and the sound is very seductive. It's kind of a wavering sound, like a wah 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 in the background, but
Mm,
that actually is occurring down in your lower brainstem, that
mm,
perception. And this is one of the reasons why I think sacred acoustics is so powerful at helping people achieve transcendental states of conscious awareness, is by causing this very powerful left-right oscillation in the lower brainstem, which is exactly what sacred acoustics is doing. That's what, just like with hypnotic regression, using a pendulum and eye movements, left, right, that is doing the same thing. That's at the midbrain level, that's occurring. And EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which has been very powerful therapeutic technique in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, is likewise using a midbrain oscillation back and forth with that's associated with eye movements. But then with sacred acoustics, you're actually going to an even more primitive level of the brain, which I think makes it more powerful because that's the essence of something like binaural beats, is it's causing an oscillation in a very primitive system, one that arose more than 300 million years ago
mm,
in evolutionary biology, before mammals even walked the earth. I mean, originally that circuit was a localization of threat, so that if you hear a sound behind your head, that circuit, the superior olivary nucleus is what it's called in the lower brainstem, is what's measuring the arrival time of sound waves from the two ears and doing the comparison and telling you where that sound is with that very powerful calculator. Um,
wow.
and the thing is, by modulating the ascending signals from the lower brainstem, you will alter kind of our connection between conscious awareness and the here, now, and sense of self of the body. So this is a way, by doing this kind of monotonization of information with this left-right oscillation, it's a way of freeing up our conscious awareness. It basically
Mm,
puts us in a hypnagogic state. Hypnagogic is between awake and asleep. So we all have been through that space. You know how kind of difficult it is to navigate. You're not driving the bus at that point. That's where dreams come from, etc. So your little ego mind is taking a break, and that's a very important part about sacred acoustics and binaural beat brainwave entrainment. Is you're letting your ego mind, the voice in your head, take a time out, and you're actually starting to identify with an aspect of self, the kind of higher soul that's a much deeper level, but is much more of kind of a neutral observer of a lot of what's going on, and is not as reactive as the ego. And that's why this kind of higher self that's accessible through binaural beats can be so powerful. And you learn to just kind of ride those tones. And, usually my little Eben Alexander ego voice will make a request or ask a question at the beginning of the meditation, but I've learned to then let that voice, that part of my conscious awareness, go into timeout for a while. And
Wow.
that's where the real power comes in, is just learning to ride those sacred acoustics tones, follow the breathing, kind of blank your mind and get into that state of non-self, and even deeper levels of kind of oneness with the universe. So a lot of possibilities with this kind of meditation.
Well, it's interesting because I think if I were to look at, over 100 near-death experiences I've talked to at this point on the podcast, I think the biggest when I ask, what could be a takeaway for everybody, it would be meditation. It's so common across the board that it's suggested. I was thinking about with the soul-inspired audience. I'm sure many who are listening have heard your story on what happened to you, but I was wondering if we can go through that a little bit. So you said it was 2008. You
Right.
had you had come down with this. Was it meningitis?
Right.
Okay,
The
yeah,
case.
let's go through that a little bit and just figure out how that happened and maybe just whatever form you want to put it in.
All right. Well, I'll keep it kind of brief so that
Mhm.
then you can focus on any specific questions if you want.
Sure.
The most important thing to say is that there's an atypical feature of my NDE that I really haven't heard about in other people's NDEs to this degree, and that is amnesia. I had no memory of Eben Alexander's life, no knowledge of Earth, humanity, this universe. It was really an empty slate going in. Now, when I first came back in the weeks and months after coma, I thought I could kind of explain that because I was still defaulting to some of my old false conventional neuroscientific knowledge, which believes that the memories are stored in the brain. So, yes, when I first woke up, this amnesia was still very powerful, but my memories came back rapidly. But the thinking was, I guess that would explain why I seem to have such a deep amnesia.
Mm.
But of course, I didn't realize, but over the next 2 months after waking up from coma, all the memories would come back and be even more complete than they had been before coma. That part was absolutely shocking, but it showed me, as we discuss in detail in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that memories are not stored in the brain. It's one of the last nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience, but there it is. And we discuss that much more fully in that book. But anyway, so amnesia is the setting. And so deep in my coma, I first became aware of this journey in what I call the earthworm eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive kind of subterranean realm. And it seemed kind of foreboding, especially my words of describing it. And yet, given the amnesia, I just accepted this is the way it is. So, no problem. And I just kind of lived with it. The good news is it didn't last forever. There came a slowly spinning white light with a perfect musical melody that opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view and led me up into this brilliant, ultra real gateway valley. Now, this is where it's important to stress that these journeys are often described as ineffable, beyond our words, beyond our language. And part of the problem is in that world, we're truly no longer in a temporal flow. So, in other words, you're in that gateway valley. You're in an area where one could see your life review, all birth, death, everything in between, simultaneously presented to you. That's the power of this realm, as it's beyond our Earth time, and so connections between events in life become far more obvious when you see them from that kind of helicopter view. And
Mm.
so the life review is something I wasn't going to have an Eben Alexander life review because of the amnesia, but that's a very important concept. The amnesia was there to teach me an even deeper lesson. And I'll get into that shortly. So here we are in this beautiful Gateway Valley. I'm a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There are millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in vast formations. Um, and down below in this meadow are thousands of beings dancing, lots of joy and merriment. I remember children playing, dogs jumping, incredible festivities. It's all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating chants and anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. And the best part about it all was I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful young woman beside me on this butterfly wing. She had sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbones, broad smile. She looked at me with a look of pure love, but she never said a word. She didn't have to. Her message to me was delivered mentally, emotionally, as a shared mental truth. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You were richly cared for. And I cannot tell you how comforting that was in that moment. Tremendously reassuring. And the other interesting thing is, as much as these words I used to describe it may sound foreign to some people, there were thousands of people who read Proof of Heaven or heard me talk about this, who those words woke up in them a memory of their own spiritual experience, even though it might not have been conscious to them before. So lots of people were reminded about their own kind of journey to similar realms by the wording that I used in Proof of Heaven. In this beautiful Gateway Valley, there blew this soft summer breeze that blew through. And that was my first awareness of the divine, of that God force, because that also had been deleted from any of my memories, any kind of religious beliefs or what have you. Excuse me, sorry.
That's okay.
So what then happened was these angelic choirs provided yet another musical portal. And I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time of the material realm collapsing down. All of that different ordering of, what I call metatime or deep time that allows the causality in the earthworm's eye view and in the Gateway Valley, places where we'd have life reviews, things like that. All of that collapsing down. And I was ascending through this light portal provided by the music of those angelic choirs until I entered what I call the core. The core was an infinite, inky darkness, but absolutely filled to overflowing with that divine love of the God force. It was something I often describe as the dazzling darkness. It was a complete resolution of all dualities. In our world, we have masculine, feminine, dark, light, good, evil, all these different gradations of possible qualities in our lives. And yet in that realm, in the core, it all resolves into pure oneness. That was where I recognized that my very conscious awareness was directly sourced in that God force, that co-creative force of love at the core of the universe. And it was absolutely beautiful, beyond any description, seeing the kind of relationships of this core realm and that beautiful orb of light that I described in Proof of Heaven that was present there. And in fact, it was kind of an oscillation. I often use the analogy, it was like standing on the edge of a black hole, where, one foot is inside and one is outside. And likewise, in that realm, in that core realm, you're kind of oscillating between pure oneness with the divine and the very first stages of separation of kind of sentience and knowing away from that deep and primordial one mind. At any rate, I would tumble back down to the earth from my view, seemingly spontaneously. But by remembering the musical notes of the melody, I could conjure up that light portal that would lead me up into the Gateway Valley, always welcomed into that ultra real scene by that beautiful girl on the butterfly wing and the thousands of butterflies and all the souls dancing in the meadow down below, then ascending again through the angelic choirs to higher levels, multiple lessons, all through all of these transitions. Most ultimately, though, the one of love. That's the deep lesson that near-death experiencers come back to this world, knowing that unconditional love of that God force is extremely healing and brings wholeness into our lives. And this is why meditation and centering prayer are, to me, such an important part of daily life, is using those, excuse me, to connect with that God force, and to use that and kind of bringing that love and kindness and compassion and mercy and acceptance into this world, in all of our thoughts and actions. So anyway, I would cycle through these levels multiple times. I was shown visions in several of the passages through the core that showed me reincarnation, life reviews. So I couldn't have an Eben Alexander life review, but I saw them in this kind of generic fashion. The flying fish vision, where when the flying fish are in the water, that's like us in the bodies. But then when we leave the body at the time of physical death, that's when the fish are up in the air. And I saw beautifully how this kind of interwoven threads of that existence showed me the kind of beauty of life reviews. It's a mid-course correction, and then of reincarnation as being an essential part of this whole process, because you couldn't get that kind of soul growth done in one lifetime.
Hmm.
So to become one with the divine can take more than one lifetime. And was never aware of the scientific evidence for reincarnation before my coma. But after my coma, I encountered all the work done by the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. And anybody who wants to get to that scientific data, go to uvadops.org and you'll learn a lot more. But in the last 65 years, that group at UVA has studied more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation. And of those cases, 1,700 they say are solved. That is, they actually found the person who lived
Wow.
before. So at least 1,700 scientifically studied cases validating that our souls tend to come back in future lifetimes, often very close by, in similar villages, towns, social settings, etc. And I think there's also a pattern where often our soul groups kind of reincarnate together. We may change roles, but
Hmm.
I think the work of Michael Newton, Brian Weiss, Robert Schwartz, and others shows a tremendous role for this kind of bigger spiritual sense of our souls and their interactions, and that all that ultimately leads to kind of evolution of consciousness. But in getting back to my NDE and to kind of finish off that story, so I passed through all these levels multiple times. There's a lot more to it all, as which I've told in many of these podcasts, et cetera, and in the book, Proof of Heaven, on my website at ebenalexander.com. But ultimately, there came a time when I could no longer conjure up the light portal from the earthworm eye view up into the Gateway Valley. And I'd been told every time I entered the core, you're not here to stay. You'll be going back, but we'll teach you many things. And so, at any rate, there did come that time where I could no longer conjure up the musical pathway to these higher spiritual levels. To say I was sad at that point would be an understatement, but I also knew I could trust I would be taken care of. And in fact, that's what happened. And the next thing I saw were thousands of people around me going off in the distance, heads bowed, some holding candles, some with hoods. And this murmuring energy was coming from all of them. And the shocking thing is, even though I'm back in this kind of earthworm eye view, the primitive starting place of it all, this murmuring energy is bringing me the same sense of kind of love and comfort that I'd found earlier at the higher levels of the Gateway Valley and the core. And
Hmm.
yet now I'm finding it at this lowest level, coming from all these beings around me, and it seems to be leading me in a direction. And then the final thing I saw in my near-death experience, 6 faces that bubbled up out of the muck. They'd say a few words and disappear. Now I can remember those faces visually, and what I heard as clearly now as if the whole thing happened yesterday, and yet it happened 16 years ago. These memories are very sharp and kind of burned in, and it was really the sixth of those faces that in many ways was most important. Five of them were physically present in the ICU room the last 24 to 48 hours of coma. So they serve a very important purpose because they tell me that the vast majority of the coma experience had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of that 7-day coma. All that timing is explained in the books. But the reality is they help very much to show when it happened, which is important from a neuroscientific standpoint. Um, and it was the last of those faces that in many ways was the most important. It was the face of a 10-year-old boy. I didn't recognize him at the time, but it was my son Bond. And they'd protected Bond from the worst news during that week. But now on Sunday morning, day 7 of coma, I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival down to 2% during that week. And now with no chance of recovery. And the doctors were recommending stopping antibiotics, taking me off the ventilator, and just letting me go. And that's when Bond realized, oh my gosh, it's much worse than they told me. He came running down the hallway into Major Bay 10. He pulled open my eyelids that had been taped shut. One eye looking over there, one eye over there, neither pupil working. Anybody out there in medicine knows that's a horrible scene. But the reality is, I could sense him, and he was pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. And throughout this whole journey, because of my amnesia, I'd always thought this can continue, it can cease, it doesn't matter. But now all of a sudden there was another soul who needed me. And I didn't know what for. I didn't understand the words, but that kind of pleading. And so now all of a sudden everything mattered. And it was probably the biggest moment of fright in the entire journey because I thought it didn't matter before and now everything mattered. And I had to somehow work my way back to him. And like so many near-death experiencers, I ended up coming back to this world out of a sense of responsibility for another soul,
Right.
even though I didn't know who that soul was at the time, didn't know this thing about our relationship as father and son. And yet I recognized that with his pleading, I had to be there for him. And that's what brought me back to this world. And when I first started waking up on the ICU bed, fighting the ventilator, they pulled out the tube. I said, "Thank you." But I was still, my brain was so frazzled by the meningitis, I still didn't recognize loved ones, my mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside. I had no idea who they were. And, but those memories came back rapidly. My language and knowledge of language came back over hours and days. And my memory of childhood events, et cetera, started coming back over the next several days. By 2 months, everything was back. And the thing is, my doctors, I tried to share the spiritual journey with them, and they would pat me on the back and say, "Well, your brain was soaking in pus. We have no idea how you're even coming back to us, but you can forget about it because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks." So I took my doctor's advice early on because I didn't remember my neurosurgical knowledge. Plus, I didn't have any of the medical details of my own illness. But the more I discovered that the next few weeks, going through my medical records, through scans, CT, MRI scans, neurologic exams, it became very clear, as is made clear in a case report on my medical records, written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. That medical case report's in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September 2018. And those authors made it very clear that my brain was in no shape to harbor any kind of hallucination or dream, much less this most profound, multifaceted, multidimensional kind of journey that I had. And not only that, but when the peer review editors for the scientific journal challenged these authors, how do you explain his recovery? It seems miraculous, unprecedented in the medical literature. And that's when they said, well, there are other cases of near-death experience that are also associated with extraordinary miraculous healing. We think that's the reason this happened. And that was good enough for the peer review scientific editors to say, okay, now we have an explanation. But like Mary C. Neal, the orthopedic surgeon who had an over 30-minute warm water drowning in 1999 in Chile, she wrote a book called To Heaven and Back. And she had a profound NDE and then a miraculous recovery. Likewise, Anita Morjani, who had a very profound NDE around her cancer, lymphoma, and then came back to this world knowing that the cancer would disappear, and it went on to disappear. So these are other cases of NDEs. And I think the big lesson to all of us is when we pay attention to our spiritual nature, and our spiritual connection with that God force, that creative force at the core of the universe, that gives us the ability to manifest this extraordinary healing and wholeness in our lives.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. I've heard the story, and I've actually read some of the book and everything. So I do encourage anyone that hasn't heard your entire story, because there's a lot more. And then I know there's a lot more that happened as things went on too. I wanted to ask you if I'm really glad you summed it up the way you did, though, because there's a few areas that I've never asked anyone before, and I want to ask this, and you may have wanted to already speak on this, but you mentioned at one time during just you sharing just now that you were looking at the life review, but you weren't having the life review of Eben Alexander because of the state that your body was in or whatnot. Now, or maybe it wasn't, and that's what my question was going to be is, why would you not be having the life review of who you are, just because your mind or because your brain is going through what it is now on the physical form if you're in a non-physical place?
I think it was what I would say is near-death experiences are always tailored for the individual who has them. And if I had scripted this, it would have been a more general kind of conventional NDE, my father, my adoptive father, who passed over 4 years before my coma, he would have been there front and center, and yet he was nowhere to be found. And also, I had this beautiful guardian angel. I think it's just because those were part of the lessons that I was being taught in, in this particular moment of understanding. And if it had been more conventional, I would have been more tempted to think it was all wishful thinking and make believe. That's
Mhm.
the essential answer. And that's why my guardian angel had to be much deeper than just my adoptive father, because if that had happened, I would have come away, in spite of a 1 in 10 million diagnosis, 1 in a billion recovery, of saying, well, I guess you only see who you want to see on the way out. So, in essence, I had to have this especially deep dive that involved the amnesia. And also, as a neuroscientist, wanting to know much more about consciousness and about the nature of memory, this particularly deep dive was very illustrative. And if I'd had a more conventional dive with a conventional memory and life review, and my father serving as the guardian angel, I would have been a little more tempted to reject it all. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think that was fascinating for me to hear only because I have heard people when they have their near-death experiences or even I always like to look at both sides. I'm definitely not on the skeptic side of things only because I've had actual in life phenomena happen. I never
Uh-huh.
had an NDE, but I had things that I cannot explain with another person where we've seen things that don't make sense to our physical
Right.
life. So I'm already kind of on that side of things, but at the same time, I do try to bring up some skeptical type questions only because I want to dig in a little further. And, when you had mentioned that you weren't having the life review of yourself, and yet your brain was in such a terrible state, almost in a complete brain dead state. I would assume. I don't know. I'm not a not a neuro brain surgeon or anything like that, so I don't know how that works. But I
Well,
would
yeah, it
assume,
was.
yeah.
I mean, my brain was definitely in very bad shape. I mean, the Glasgow coma scale in you or me would be 15. In a corpse, they get a 3. Anything below 9 is deep coma. And most of that week, I was in a scale of 6 or 7.
Wow.
In fact, there are probably times when I was as low as a 5. And there was one time in the ER when I cried out, God help me. And just by using language, you get big points in the Glasgow coma scale. So that
Mm,
took me up to 11. But it was just for that one statement. I don't remember saying it at all. Had been thrashing and seizing for hours
mm.
before that. And so it really was just a very deep coma with a tremendous amount of damage. But then, of course, recovering all that. How did that happen? It does seem miraculous, and yet when we study these cases, as those peer review scientists knew, these cases are not uncommon, where a profound NDE can be associated with profound and kind of unexpected healing. And that's been kind of a hallmark of NDEs uh, throughout this modern phase of their study. I know that Dr. Bruce Grayson, who was one of the authors of that case report on my case, who works at UVA and kind of heads up their NDE studies. Um, he was first driven into this field in the mid 1970s when, as a psychiatrist, he saw that people could have shifts in their thinking in an NDE that would heal them in ways far beyond anything medically possible, to him as a psychiatrist. So when he would see people have these spontaneous transformations for the better through an NDE, he paid big attention because it showed him healing that was of an extraordinary nature, and
Mhm.
certainly something to be duplicated and uh, mimicked by healers. So why not take advantage of the natural ability of us to come into these incredible transformations, healing, and coming into wholeness that can occur through these spiritual journeys?
So you don't believe the fact that your brain was in the condition it wasn't the main reason why you didn't have a Eben Alexander life review.
I think it was part of the but like I said, it's a soul journey, and part of what your soul needs to know now to help you in this great transformation is what you pick up in a near death experience. That's why people come back. One of the most amazing things about near-death experiences is not so much what the people report, but how their lives are transformed for the better.
Hmm.
And they become just much better people. They come back less religious, more spiritual. They come back much more focused on the higher good, much more into relationships and their importance and not into material stuff. So huge positive transformation.
I had a question around the core. You throughout the experience that you had, we'll put the life review aside, but throughout the experience, and even up to the point where you were ascending into this core, was there ever a feeling of recognition of you? Not
Yeah,
so any form of like so right now who you are talking with me,
yeah.
is there still any recognition from see, I want to flip it. I want to flip it. I'm not looking at it like it was that even. I'm thinking, are you that? And now you recognize that you are that.
Absolutely. Well, I mean,
Okay.
to me, all of it is very consistent with being my soul line of discovery. And there had to be that phase of kind of amnesia and ignorance and discovery to help me come into this kind of higher wisdom about it all. And I think that's why I had that amnesia. I mean, NDEs, you could probably say, are always kind of incomplete in one way or another because the people don't go on and die. But we can certainly make strong conclusions about NDEs as indicative of what happens when we die, because there's a beautiful book by Christopher Kerr, who's involved in hospice work, works at Hospice Buffalo in New York, upstate New York. And he wrote a beautiful book about 5 or 6 years ago called Death is But a Dream. And in that book, all he does is deal with hospice and terminal care, but he finds that 86% of his study group uh, had these very powerful end of life dreams and visions. And of that 86% who had these visions, and they would include loved ones who had passed from the physical plane, coming to welcome them to that world. It involved resolution of any kind of conflicts in their life, things that they still had to make amends for, had regrets about, et cetera. Um, and in fact, you find the very same things happen in terminal care and palliative care as happen in near death experiences. So, yes, what happens when we die is what is represented by near death experiences. And I think that that's a very important kind of indicator, this kind of continuity. And of course, then when you also bundle in all of those reincarnation cases, and now some people are very concerned that a loved one might reincarnate before you get there to be welcomed to heaven by that loved one.
Mhm.
And what I can tell you is, given the timeless nature of that realm and how um, the majority of those who have life reviews say the life review is like a reliving of events, not just a remembering. And about three-quarters of those who have life reviews say that the life review is a reliving of events from everybody's perspective. So, in other words, if you were busy handing out a lot of pain and suffering in your lifetime, in your life review, you get on the receiving end of that. You get to see what it feels like the way you treated other people. So, in many ways, the life review is like the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated, written into the very fabric of the universe. And I think that's a very important concept for people to get. And that's about three-quarters of people who have life reviews in a large series reported by Bruce Grayson in the fall of 2021 in the Journal of Near Death Studies. But it's an extraordinary kind of demonstration of the power of that realm, where you could relive your entire life and things like that during a cardiac arrest. I mean, it's pretty fascinating stuff. And yet, this is what you uncover when you study these kinds of cases.
That's fascinating. And I have heard that many times about how when we have the life review, we feel the feelings of the people we impacted and all those types of things. I think the reason why I was really digging into who you were on the other side was because I've talked to so many people who've mentioned that although going to the other side, they felt more expansive, different than who they were in this embodiment, that there were moments, and this is in some cases, this isn't in all cases, and this is part of maybe I'm a truth seeker, I guess, as I've been told. um, there was moments where I was told that there were parts of themselves that they still felt. Maybe it was their sense of humor. Maybe it was just recognizing that they are still care, like they're still here, like there's still an essence of them still alive. A lot of them have the absence of fear and all the negative things, it seems, kind of goes more into the loving side of things.
Right.
But I guess in that essence, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, was some of their ego still online from this life form? Was it not? I guess I'm trying to really dig into that aspect of it because if you're saying you didn't feel anything like yourself, and that can actually be fearful for some people to think, oh my goodness, because we are so stuck in ego here in this world. We're so stuck in who we are. Is there any sense of, should
Well,
people fear that?
I don't want to be misleading. I mean, when I look back on it, there's no question that it was my soul that was going through that awakening.
Okay.
My soul and my higher soul is the part that really accumulates all that knowledge. But, in that NDE, I wasn't necessarily experiencing the pure existence of my higher soul as much as a lower aspect of soul. You got to remember in this whole discussion of consciousness, we've come to acknowledge that there's a tremendous role for what's called the subconscious,
Mhm.
stuff that's not immediately and obviously available to our conscious awareness in the here and now. But for example, the subconscious plays a tremendous role in a lot of our behaviors. It plays a tremendous role in dreams and the kind of dream material that comes into our lives. So important to point out that as much as we're talking about this conscious awareness, is that at certain stages in our existence, parts of that might be obscured. And that's part of the process of discovery, part of the process of kind of learning and teaching that we share as sentient beings with our fellow beings. But in very deep meditation, I can get to that kind of state where I feel almost purely that higher soul. But it's a rare state to get to. It's difficult to get to, and more commonly, we're experiencing more kind of the ego and kind of lower versions of soul awareness. But this is where meditation and centering prayer to me are so important on a regular basis, is because I'm routinely getting into that very deep level of kind of non-self. It's a sense of that pure conscious awareness, and yet it has the vestiges of that kind of higher soul, and it's trying to discern, the lessons from various life events. But it's all about that learning and teaching and our participating with each other and discovering these things about basically the universe at large and our relationship to it. And that's where NDEs and meditation and centering prayer can provide so much power to us in coming into oneness and wholeness and healing.
It kind of goes with, a lot of times when I'm hearing people's experiences, sometimes it can be a little bit over some people's heads if they haven't had this type of experience themselves. So I'm always trying to bring it down into a more uh, easier to digest, ideology kind of thing. And I've always used this idea that I use my hand and, this is us. Let's say this is us. This is our self. And this is your higher self. And this is Eben Alexander. And you are part of this higher soul. And when this life is finished, you're back to this place of who you are. So you had mentioned earlier, if people are reincarnating, do they have the fear of not, when they cross over, will they not see that person? Well, if their higher self is still constantly online, if it's still always part of the all that is, then of course you would still be able to experience that soul
Right,
or that energy because their higher soul is over there.
right,
I only look at it like this because we talk about past lives and future lives, and the more and more I talk to people, because time doesn't make much sense to a lot of us. If I look at it like this, it's almost like everything's happening at the same time. There's almost like a
right.
parallel, every life is already happening. And I know that's hard to understand, but it helps me understand it better. So do you think the
Right.
way I'm describing it kind of makes sense that we have this
I think
higher.
it does. Important to remember the subjective and the objective. And the subjective, of course, is our experience of things, of existing, the subjective I and me. Who is that? Um, and the interesting thing is, in that subjective space, we have access to birth, death, everything in between. In deep meditation, we have ways of getting into that and separating from earth time. Whereas in the objective world is one that seems to be following this kind of plodding nature of Earth time. And yet that's not really what any one of us experiences. Nobody
Mm.
experiences that objective reality. Quantum physics tells us very clearly that there is no objective physical world that's independent of the observing mind. That's a very important point. The observing mind is critical, just as John Wheeler, head of quantum physics at Princeton in the mid 20th century. John Wheeler had to come up with what he called the participatory anthropic principle to explain how photons coming from distant quasars would behave. And this anthropic principle is absolutely one that demands the intersection of mind with this physical world. So the mind is a very important concept. Likewise, in the measurement paradox in quantum physics, it's all about the mind making a decision of how to measure certain properties. The notion of contextuality in quantum physics. These are all about the intersection of mind with the physical world, and an admission that none of it is just some naked reality physical world unraveling on its own, but that ultimately this is about minds intersecting with reality. And the mind is ultimately the thing that determines that emergent pattern in the physical world. And this is where
Mm.
we go in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. We go a great distance towards uniting science and spirituality around concepts of idealism or panentheism. Those are notions that mind has a very real power in this world, with panentheism meaning basically that God mind is within all of the universe. And that's what we're really doing, is dealing with a brain that filters in that primordial God mind, gives us an illusion of separation and
Mm.
identity. And yet, in fact, we're really sharing the one mind. The analogy I often use, we're sharing the dream of the one mind. And I describe the one mind as this diamond. And each facet of the diamond is an individual sentient being, participating in learning and teaching with other sentient beings, other facets, to help that kind of primordial mind grow into a greater version of itself. I mean, this is a voyage of discovery. Free will based in quantum indeterminacy is wide open. And that's really the kind of emerging view we have. And given that in neuroscience, every one of those neurons in the brain that we're thinking is so deeply related to consciousness, every one of them is essentially a quantum computer, because all the operations of that neuron, synaptic vesicles, releasing transmitter, ion channels, opening and closing, those are all quantum level events. And so they allow for this profound sense of top-down causality and organization. If you read George F.R. Ellis, he's written extensively about top-down causation in quantum physics. And I think that these principles, in a larger sense, especially when you come to acknowledge the documented role of quantum physics in photosynthesis, in human sense of smell, in bird migration, being able to see the magnetic field, et cetera, we start to realize that quantum phenomena are deeply involved with our biology. And I think the
Mm.
ultimate example of this is the relationship between our consciousness and quantum physics. And of course, there are
Mhm.
many quantum physicists who will scoff at that and say they have nothing to do with each other, but that's only because they don't know enough about consciousness. And I can tell you, in the world of consciousness, there are physicists who have come to recognize the power of uniting concepts of consciousness in physics. For example, Roger Penrose wrote that beautiful book, The Emperor's New Mind, in 1989, and he's won a Nobel Prize. He's been into this work for ages. Brian Josephson, another Nobel laureate, who also is deeply into the notions of consciousness being related to quantum phenomena. Um, Minas Kafatos, Amit Goswami. There are several other physicists who have written extensively about this. Bernard Carr, who was one of Stephen Hawking's postdoctoral students. Bernard Carr has written about hyperdimensional spaces in terms of consciousness and different ways of looking at the flow of time in different dimensional spaces, et cetera. So there's a tremendous amount of overlap in research now that's linking consciousness and quantum phenomena which should be obvious to anybody who's paying attention to what's going on in the brain and the mind and trying to link them. So to me, it's a fascinating time to be alive, to be
Mm.
assimilating these kind of things. And then you have that whole kind of entering issue of artificial intelligence, because I
Hmm.
think, especially as quantum computing gets up to speed, we might actually be able to come up with some models that would examine far more advanced kind of notions of consciousness and linkage between this mental layer of the universe and the physical world. So
Wow.
lots of excitement going around.
Yeah, there's a lot happening, and I was just thinking a bunch of the things you were saying. I was right in alignment with what you were saying. With AI, you know, the question of is there consciousness kind of emerging through AI and all these different things that people probably don't even want to go and think about because it can be scary to even think about that. But it can also be an amazing thing because it'll teach us so much more about consciousness. You mentioned the observant mind, the general whole. I look at I look at apps like TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, all these different things. And they've really become a part of people's day to day for a lot of people in my generation, younger than me, my own kids, people older than me as well. And it doesn't take much. You can go on any kind of app like like TikTok and look up orbs. I'm bringing this up because we could take 90% of some of these things and say that they're AI generated or whatnot. But what I've noticed is the more people see these things, the more other people see these things. And so if our observant mind is all interconnected, if we're all connected and we start to see someone, oh, this person over in New Jersey seen this, now all of a sudden someone in Colorado, and now someone in the UK is seeing the same thing. Now someone in Canada is seeing the same thing. If everyone's seeing these things, the bigger question is, and these some of these things are the most beautiful colors, and they're zooming in, and these orbs are moving in these very strange states. I mean, these things weren't being observed 10 years ago. This is all just happening now. And I guess my question to you would be, is that why? Because we're observing something that we weren't aware of? Was it already there and present and our awareness hadn't witnessed it, or are they just now showing themselves?
Well, I think you're hitting on it pretty heavily, that this group awareness is a very real thing. Rupert Sheldrake has talked about the morphic resonance, that there would be kind of information fields that would dictate how things in biology would emerge. And I think there's a lot to his kind of thinking about this. And certainly that notion of the hundredth monkey, where uh, you cross a threshold where awareness among a certain group of sentient beings then becomes kind of a collective conscious truth.
Mm.
And I think there's a lot of that going on now. Orbs are something, if you'd asked me about orbs before my coma, I would have scoffed at you. Since then, I've actually had experience with orbs. In fact, often when I would give my talk about my near death experience, especially when I got to that beautiful part about my guardian angel on the butterfly wing and discovering her identity, when I would show that up on the screen, somebody would take a picture in the audience and you'd see this big purple orb right next to me.
Wow.
Now, I used to think that, of course, when I would talk about that guardian angel, I'd get kind of misty eyed and tearful because of the kind of tragedy of that story. It has to do with my adoption history. I won't say much more now. Um, but the reality is, I came to soon to realize that maybe she's just right there with me, because I think that's what that orb energy is.
Mm.
And I know you can invite orbs into your life, joyful playing and dancing. Start, running your camera, and you'll start finding some orbs, often assimilating if you invite them in. And of course, you have to believe in them.
Right.
That helps. But the interesting thing is that when you do that, they then start to show up, and you have photographic evidence of these orbs. I know Karen had this beautiful adventure with her future business partner, where they were out in the night at a retreat area, and they were trying to conjure up their guides, their spiritual guides. And when she was in the process of doing this, he was taking photographs, and there appeared this beautiful blue orb right in front of her when she sensed her blue guide to
Mm.
be there. So yes, there's a lot of truth to this. It's enhanced if you believe in it, because then you find more and more evidence of it. But
Mm.
then more people who read about this, hear about it, etc., yes, it starts becoming part of the culture because that's part of our reality, and because mind over matter is a profound kind of truth about our existence. So the more we kind of acknowledge these things and admit their possibility and start to entertain their existence in our mind, the more they start to show up in our lives. So
Wow.
I think, it's a very important time to kind of open our minds, be kind and gentle and compassionate about all this, and help initiate the highest and best good for all involved. I mean, that's really what NDEs teach us, is bring this love back to this world,
Hmm.
share it with our fellow beings. The best way to be loved by the universe is to serve as a conduit for the love of the universe, the love of the creator for the creation, and share all that out to this world. So unfortunately, in our modern era, there's a lot of political polarization and kind of conflict and war, but it is high time that we learn the deep lessons emerging from the scientific study of consciousness to usher all of us into a far grander period of compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance, forgiveness, and never forget gratitude. And I think that's what will help this planet to heal from a lot of its worst current afflictions.
One of the most amazing parts of your story, just that you spoke about today, was when you came back into the lower levels. So you'd gone all through this higher realm of levels and felt this love and this adoration or what was going on. But even in your lower realm, coming back into the earthworm before you came back, you still felt in essence a piece of that, which means really that's probably in alignment with your 3D body now, and
Right.
that means that we are still part of that. That's still through who we are.
Absolutely. That
So,
that was what was so reassuring, at the very end of it all, after these lofty spiritual journeys into the Gateway Valley and the core realm and multiple repetitions, the beautiful angels, guides, everything that I was witnessing, now tumbling back to that earth where my view, surrounded by all these beings. I later call that it was a power of prayer. That's what I felt I was
mm,
receiving, was this beautiful kind of upburst of joyful energy that was happening in that lowest, kind of murkiest of spiritual levels. And to me, that was extremely
mm,
reassuring and promising as I came back to this world, because it showed me, in essence, as many people tell you, heaven is right here.
mm,
Heaven is where we are. It's a state of mind. That doesn't make it any less powerful as a very real force in our lives. To say it's a state of mind as opposed to a place. It's not a physical place. But in fact, all physical places are within this mind thing that we're talking about. So
mhm.
it's a 180-degree flip from kind of my formal materialist or physicalist thinking, and yet it's one that's far more comforting and more kind of aligning with what I know to be true about this universe and what I can see as optimism in discovering our unity and that binding force of love that connects us all.
It's amazing. I get down the rabbit hole of thinking constantly, and when I think of something like that, I think of how we're evolving, where evolution continues
Right.
throughout the human evolution, and I think to myself, will there be a time where heaven will be with us? Meaning, will that separate? Because we feel separate here, and that
Right.
separation seems to be there's this feeling of that it's not as separate as it once was, and that we're kind of coming on a line with the idea that we're right there. And it's,
Well, it has a lot to do with learning.
yeah,
Learning of relationships, learning of deep truths. And the more all of us can participate in that, I think the more we'll start coming in alignment with that, connection to that divine, infinitely loving God force. We can do that individually as sentient beings. We can approach that. And the more we do that as a kind of a group of humanity, the more I think will bring that heaven to this world.
mm, amazing. This has been an amazing conversation. You did mention Eben Alexander or Eben, sorry if it's Eben or Eben. I've said your name different ways to different people, but ebenalexander.com is your website. That's where people can get your books and all those types of things, right? And they can
Right.
find out everything on you.
And I'd highly recommend it on that website. When you get there, right on the entry page is a 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness, a little card that wags in your face. And if you click on that, leave your first name and an email address, you're off and running to a 33-day email drip campaign that has major concepts times 33 from that book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But this is a free workbook resource. I also highly recommend sacredacoustics.com for anyone who wants to learn more about meditation. It's been proven. There's a pilot study that talks about sacred acoustics giving 26% reduction in anxiety symptoms over 2 weeks to a
Wow.
busy Manhattan psychiatrist practice versus only a 7% reduction in anxiety over 2 weeks in people who got standard talk therapy. So sacred acoustics, that pilot study by Dr. Anna Yusim in Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in January 2020 is very powerful defense of sacred acoustics as a mode of leaving anxiety behind. But that's just the beginning when
Hmm.
you realize what it's truly doing in terms of opening up your awareness to that primordial mind. People have connected with souls of departed loved ones, et cetera. There are many possibilities there. But if you explore sacredacoustics.com, you'll learn much more about it all. And finally, I'd recommend innersanctumcenter.com. That's a website where we have many interviews we've done during the pandemic with thought leaders on consciousness. There are several other things there. There's a mental health practitioner course we did with Dr. Anna Yusim, plus some Thursday webinars we've done for years with our devoted people. Anyway, so innersanctumcenter.com is another resource, but I encourage people to dive in. There's a tremendous amount going on in this world that is favorable and beneficial to this kind of understanding of the primacy of consciousness and of our ability to perform mind over matter to get the life we want. And that is one that involves love and kindness and compassion for all of our fellow beings. I encourage people to visit, stay in touch through those websites. Don't forget the reading list at ebenalexander.com, recommended reading in the FAQ page. And there are many interviews and conferences, videos, and audios that are also there at ebenalexander.com.
This wouldn't be a soul inspired episode if I didn't finish it by asking you a simple question. It's not simple. It's a joke. And it's why are we here?
Know thyself. That's ultimately it. That's the inscription on the temple to Apollo at Delphi in Greece. Know thyself. And once you understand that we're sharing the mind of the universe, know thyself is a pretty exciting order indeed. So, and it all comes down to that knowing involves loving and caring for our fellow beings. So it's all one beautiful package.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I always turn to the audience, say, please continue to like, share, and subscribe to The Soul Inspired. Please share this with somebody that could help them. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Evan, for being on the show.
Joe, thanks for having me on. Great talking with you. Hopefully, we'll talk again soon.
So